Hey, welcome to today's Weapon Workshop. This is a series where we test how far weapons can go in Steel Path. Now, any weapon can make a joke of Star Chart, but Steel Path is where they really start to hit their limits, and today we are covering the Tenet Tetra. You can acquire this weapon by killing a Sister of Parvos after completing your Call of the Tempestrari quest. After completing that quest, you'll be able to hunt down sisters similar to how you can liches after War Within. One of the benefits of Tenet weapons is similar to Kuva weapons where you can control the element that they roll with, and sometimes you can even get dual stat elements like magnetic if you want, which I actually prefer on the Tenet Tetra over heat or toxin because it allows me to run cold, which did get an update in Jade Shadows, but that's entirely up to you. I actually have a few builds that work very well in Steel Path I want to show you guys, and some of them are more fun than others while some are more effective, but I'm going to be covering some Steel Path basics first, so if you're a Steel Path veteran and you just want to skip to the weapon builds, go ahead and click that in the timestamps below. But if you're new to Steel Path, we're going to be covering things like primers, companions, and arcanes before we get to the build section. So let's go over what a primer is first and foremost. It's something that can apply a lot of status effects, usually viral, since viral will be increasing the damage from our main damage source. And for this example, we're going to use the Epitaph, which is a secondary weapon with a very high status chance and a high AoE. Now, it doesn't have to be a secondary weapon, it could be something like Grendel's Nourish, or even Companions, which we'll talk about later. But as you can see here, the Epitaph is applying a ton of status effects, a bunch of viral, so all we have to do is swap over to our Tenet Tetra and mow them all down. These are level 195 Steel Path enemies, by the way. This should highlight how important viral is to any builds, especially in Steel Path. That's why primers are essential. Now let's talk about companions. We're going to start with Sentinels. Diriga is my Sentinel of choice for priming enemies, mainly because of its precept Arc Coil, which can inherit the elements from your Sentinel weapon with the help of Manifold Bond. Pair that with Momentous Bond, and anytime you kill an Eximus, you're going to be getting another random element on top of that. Contagious Bond allows it to get a lot of kills if it does ever end up getting the last hit, and Duplex Bond is great because whenever you use a certain amount of energy, you can make a clone that doesn't use Arc Coil, but will still fire your Sentinel weapon. I can throw some infographics on where to get these bond mods. It's going to be from hub areas like Fortuna, Cetus, and Necrolysk. But moving on to Sentinel weapons, we really like Hellstrom as a primer. Now if you want to just kill stuff, you can use Verglis. Verglis Prime just came out with Sevagoth Prime. But if you're just trying to prime stuff for your weapons to kill, Hellstrom is the way to go. It has multi-hit rockets, and if you have a bunch of speed built into this along with viral and heat, you're going to be applying viral and heat like crazy. I'll show you here. It is just going to be applied to absolutely everything. And the thing that's nice about Sentinels is they never leave your shoulder, so most of the time they're going to be shooting stuff that you're aiming at. Now you see it applies almost 10 stacks of viral, makes everything extremely squishy, and it allows us to just tear through this enemy group. Next, I want to talk about the Panzer Vulpaphyla, which is actually my personal favorite. The reason I like this thing so much is because it can get Reinforced Bond and Tenacious Bond, and it can have Viral Quills. Now, it's not going to be as effective as the Hellstrom, because a Sentinel will follow you on your shoulder and always target what you want to target, but Viral Quills is very effective at applying viral to a room and group of enemies. It'll actually tick up instead of down. The only downside is that because this isn't a Sentinel, it will attack targets on its own, not always the targets you're prioritizing. Now, if you're holding down an objective and you're not moving from room to room, this is actually fine. Everything will be affected by viral quills. But if you're trying to blow through the mission and you're going from room to room very quickly, there's no promise that your Panzer Vulpaphyla will be able to keep up with you. Now, we throw Bite onto it to raise the crit chance above 50% so we can benefit from Tenacious Bond, which gives us a 20% final crit multiplier, which is great. And then we also put the shields above 1200 to benefit from Reinforced Bond. Now, Reinforced Bond is incredible because it massively increases fire rate, which on a weapon like Tenet Tetra, which has a very low fire rate already, really helps it shine and make it feel much better. Now, I'll let you see Viral Quills in action, and you can also see the fire rate increase. So as you can see, the viral is ticking up on the targets, making them very squishy, and you can also see that our Tenet Tetra, same one that we were using with our Diriga, is firing much faster than it was before. Really like Panzer Vulpaphylas here. Next, let's talk about Hounds. Now, these can be acquired from killing your sisters at Parvos, so if you have a Tenet Tetra, odds are you already have a Hound as well. The thing that makes these great are their precepts. Now, if you get a synergized Prospectus precept and match it with Manifold Bond, and then you mod their melee weapon out for viral damage, your precepts can actually do viral damage as well, so that makes it a great primer. Pair that with Contagious Bond, and Hounds can actually clear entire rooms by themselves, much like Vergless can with Sentinels. Now you can also run a Reinforced Bond on this, which is great because you can bring their shields above 1200, and like I said, makes your weapon feel much better if it's a slow firing weapon, or if you're just a fire rate fan, it'll make your weapon feel better in general. So I'll show you how this thing works. Preset mods work from left to right, so you're going to see the first preset mod, and then we get Synergized Prospectus, which applies a lot more status and hits enemies a lot more often. We're going to get a few kills here to show how much the viral kicks in, and to show you the fire rate increase, and then I'll just show you my Hound killing the rest of these enemies by itself because of Contagious Bond. Hounds can be very strong this way. And lastly, we have MOAs. Now you can see my parts here in the top right. I actually like MOAs a lot. They're actually my second favorite option because you can run Reinforced Bond on them because their shields can go above 1200, so you get that fire rate increase. Manifold Bond is great, and I really like their precepts. Whiplash Mine is one of my favorite precepts in the game, and if you run Contagious Bond here, they can also secure a lot of kills, but only if they get the last hit, which is not going to be as common unless you're using something like Vergless, of course. Which brings me to my next point, is that they also use Sentinel weapons. Now, we're going to use Hellstrom here because we're using Companions as an example of a primer, but if you do want them to just put in work, you can absolutely slap Vergless onto these with Contagious Bond, and they will kill things entirely on their own. For some reason, the Precept would not activate in the Simulacrum, so I just loaded into a Steel Path Conjunction Survival, and here you can see it in action. The Precept mod here is awesome. It applies Viral, and it just groups them all up into giant balls like a Nidus or Gyre ability. It's really solid. I really like the MOAs a lot. Now let's talk about Arcanes. We're only going to cover in this section the Arcanes that go on your Warframe. Now the Arcanes that go on your weapon are also very important, but we'll cover that one going over builds. As far as Warframe Arcanes for the Tenet Tetra go, I would really only recommend Arcane Rage, Arcane Avenger, Arcane Acceleration, or Arcane Primary Charger. Now, if you don't have any of these at level 5, don't own level 1s, or just don't want to use these in favor of something like Arcane Energized with Molt Augmented, that's totally fine. This weapon does not need a Warframe Arcane to make it work, but if you do want that extra damage or that extra usability in Arcane Acceleration's case, then feel free to put it on if you got an open slot. For Kullervo, for example, my guy that I usually use to test out weapons, I don't really need Energize on him, so I run Rage on him to test out these weapons and see how far they go. Again, totally your call, and they are not essential. Now let's get into the actual build for the weapon. Now this is what I believe to be the strongest Tenet Tetra build right now. Now I have two. I have a magnetic and I have a heat valence Tenet Tetra. And every single time the magnetic one came out on top, most likely because it is a dual element and it allows you to run single elements without it combining. Now, Corrosive Cold build that I have right here is only going to be good when you have viral, so keep that in mind. If you do not want to use a primer, we do have a viral heat build that I can go over. It's not going to hit as hard as if you had a primer and built Corrosive Cold, but this build is phenomenal. It's the one that you've been seeing on screen all this time. And we run Galvanized Scope and Critical Delay. This puts us to a 174% chance to crit. Pair that with Vigilante Supplies, we're going to be hitting a lot of oranges and sometimes even red crits. Now we throw Vital Sense on there to buff up that damage. Primed Cryo Rounds mainly because from Jade Shadow's update, it allows us to completely freeze the enemy at 10 stacks, but it also increases our crit damage multiplier, which is always nice. Prime Shred for punch through, and the fire rate definitely helps offset the fire rate decrease from Critical Delay. Galvanized Chamber for your multi-shot, and Corrosive, obviously, just so you can shred through armor. Now, if you are struggling against Murmur, for instance, with this build, I would swap out Primed Cryo Rounds for Radiated Reload, since the Murmur take a lot more damage from radiation. Here you're seeing the build in action. It is making a mess of 200 plus Steel Path enemies right now. I'm in a Conjunction Survival Fisher, which is the highest you're going to get organically. You can obviously push this higher if you end up doing an Endurance run in Survival on Steel Path or something like that. But as far as regular gameplay goes, this is pushing the limits of how high it is. It's higher than normal Conjunction Survival, so keep that in mind. this build will deal with all forms of organic gameplay. It is very solid, and it's a lot of crit heavy options here. Now, the reason my fire rate is so fast in this clip in particular is because I have a MOA on. Now, if you don't want to use a MOA and you want to use a Sentinel or something that can't push above 1200 shields for that tenacious bond fire rate increase, I highly recommend putting on an acceleration arcane to your Warframe if you have one. But if you don't worry, we have other builds that will be shifting critical delay out for something else. And while I feel this build is the strongest, the other one is more fun in my opinion, and it's not that far behind. Now keep in mind, I am leaving out any kind of Warframe buffs you can apply to your weapons because I do want these weapons to be seen and used universally by everybody. That's the only real way I can test their viability. I don't want to incorporate someone like Rhino's Roar or Harrow's crit chance and fire rate. But keep in mind, if you do main a frame that does make up for these shortcomings and is a weapon platform frame, you can make this weapon go a lot higher than you're seeing right now. But for the sake of this video's integrity, we're not going to be including those. So now we're going to go over the viral heat build. Now this is going to be the easiest to use, hands down the most accessible of all the builds we are using today, and it's because you do not need to rely on a primer. Now most people's bread and butter is viral heat. You can almost never go wrong with this, but the newest content in Warframe, the Whisper in the Walls section, brought a new faction called Murmur, which takes substantially less damage from viral. And viral is not just a status effect, it is a damage type. So if you're fighting Murmur with viral, you're not going to have that good of a time, although it will probably still get the job done. That being said, Infested Deimos is also the same way, and that is why I like Corrosive Cold more. I usually try not to run viral on my builds because of the damage type that viral is. I don't find it to be effective against too many things, but the status is phenomenal, so that's why I always rock a primer. That being said though, if you do not have a reliable primer or do not want to rely on a primer, viral heat is absolutely the way you're going to want to go because of how important viral procs really are. You really can't go wrong with it. And the build for the most part is the same. We just swapped the elements around. It's still galvanized chamber, still vital sense, still galvanized scope, still prime shred, critical delay. Still using primary deadhead, vigilante supplies. But this time, if you are going against Murmur, I actually probably wouldn't even use radiation. I would probably just use a different build. Now, if you really do want your viral on, you can still put on radiated reload. That is going to be fine as long as you have that radiation damage type in, because the Murmur are weak to radiation. Then you can still probably get the job done. But for all other content, viral heat should absolutely get the job done. Here's the build in action. Not really much to be said here. It's viral heat. Of course, it's going to cook. Now, I couldn't get into a Fisher mission of this conjunction survival, so we're only doing 190 plus enemies right now. It's going to scale up to 200 eventually, but, you know, I'm not paying attention to life support, so I never really get that far. But just for testing the weapon, it absolutely does kill these guys just perfectly fine. I am not relying on my MOA. Anytime they hit it, it's extra viral procs. That's great. But for the most part, we're applying them ourselves, and it's, you know, speaking for itself. And I'm going to throw an Acolyte kill in here because it makes my brain happy. Now to our final build, the Frosty build. This one is actually my favorite of the three simply because it is the most fun. Now, Viral Heat and Corrosive Cold are going to be more effective in terms of damage, but Frosty will still carry you through Steel Path all the way up until the high hundreds. It can even go to 200. It is just not going to be as effective. Now, the thing that makes this so fun is Shivering Contagion. So for those unaware, when the Jade Shadows update dropped, the cold status got changed, so now when you get to 10 stacks of cold, it completely freezes targets. Pair that with a high fire rate weapon, high status chance, and Shivering Contagion, and you're freezing entire rooms by just pulling left click. Now, that is really strong, and we actually are not going to be hitting as hard, like I said earlier, so instead we're going to be using Galvanized Aptitude to help us with damage, because on the other builds, we're killing in 1 to 3 shots, usually, unless it's an Eximus, but here, it's not going to be the case. We're going to be hitting it fast, and we're trying to apply as much status as possible to freeze rooms. So we're going to be using Galvanized Aptitude because the enemy is going to be staying alive long enough for us to actually benefit from this damage increase. That's why we put it here. On top of that, we have Hammer Shot for more status since we don't have any gold status mods in this build. And that crit damage is nice. Pair it with Vital Sense. I used to run Hunter Munitions here, but Jade Shadows actually made Slash not as good. It's still very good, just not as strong because of massive health upgrades during the resistance change. So We actually swapped that out for Vital Sense just so we can do more damage on the target. Now, 100 munitions actually could still be good if you're running a insta-kill companion, you know, like if you're doing a Hound or you're using Verglas, it could still be good there because of the damage increase that companions have against bleeding targets. But if you don't want to rely on your companion for kills, Vital Sense I would absolutely put over there. Now with Galvanized Scope, we do not have critical delay in this build, but with Galvanized Scope, we are still hitting above 100% crit, which means we are going to always be hitting critical shots. Vigilante Supplies can still rarely buff that up to a red crit, but we're going to be hitting plenty of oranges. It's just not going to be as many and not as many reds. And here it is, the build in action. It's just freezing everything and everyone. Now, the higher the fire rate, the better the build's going to be. The status chance is great. You just freeze entire rooms, as I said, especially with a MOA that's bringing them all into place. It's phenomenal. It honestly doubles up as a survivability mod because if they can't shoot, you can't die. So that's really nice. Keep in mind though, all of these builds have been tested through Conjunction Survival, which is like the top 1% of missions in the entire game when considering Steel Path leveled enemies. So unless you're doing Conjunction Survival or 200 plus Steel Path, this build is going to be even more effective than what you're seeing on screen right now. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed all these builds today. I spend a lot of time testing these, like an absurd, like weeks testing these builds. So I know that these 3 builds are, at least for me, the best ones I could possibly come up with. Now, if you think you can get one that's better, or if you see any flaws in my mod setups or anything like that, let me know in the comments below because I'm always willing to hear what people think is better and test it out myself. But if you do enjoy the builds and they end up working for you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing as that helps out the channel a lot. But I hope you enjoy these builds. You all have a phenomenal day, and I'll catch you later. Peace.